I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Ingo Lambrecht, a clinical psychologist living and working in Auckland, New Zealand. He's also been trained and graduated as a sangoma, a South African shaman. He's published and presented widely on the complex relationship between shamanism and psychoanalysis. He works extensively with the Māori at Māori Mental Health Service in Auckland. You may read a piece that Dr. Lambrecht and I wrote together on psychoanalytic and ritual spaces as transitional spaces in the Fenris Wolf Volume 8, available from Trapart Books. That's Trapart Books. You may also read Dr. Lambrecht's presentation from the Psychoanalysis, Art and Occult Conference held in London in 2016 in the Fenris Wolf Volume 9, also available from Trapart Books. Dr. Lambrecht is currently editing a volume on culture and psychosis. For more, I've also linked to a keynote he gave at a recent ISPS international event, the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, available from Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's Trapart.net. You may also find this episode at YouTube at Trapart Film's YouTube channel. Just search for Trapart Film or Rendering Unconscious Podcast at YouTube. For more information, you can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and sign up for my newsletter on the contact page to stay abreast of all upcoming events. You can also visit the Rendering Unconscious main website, renderingunconscious.org. And follow me at Instagram and Twitter at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Thank you so much for listening to Rendering Unconscious Podcast and for your support. You can support the podcast at our Patreon. That's patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. Your support is so appreciated. Thank you so much to all of our Patreon patrons.
The sun is setting, whereas here it is rising. I just saw the beautiful strip of orange rising as I was cycling into the hospital and seeing it rise in the darkness, and it's exquisite. So it's lovely to hear that it's sitting on your side.
Yeah, I see it here setting now. It's perfect.
Wonderful. What a strange thing to talk across the world.
It's so cool, and especially how it's in real time and like there's no lag or anything. Amazing.
Phenomenal. Yeah. And I suppose that's exactly what we often are curious about, isn't it? These spaces that are kind of liminal, strange, and time-wise get lost in altered states of being. So that's why we got connected in a way, didn't we? We got connected through our interest in consciousness and psychoanalysis and how we would talk. I do recall us, I think it was Iceland where we met. Would that be fair?
Yep.
Yes, and I remember us walking along those streets and talking about those kind of strange experiences of psychedelics and trance states and how that might relate to the healing space. And as we talked about how we both thought that actually there's a lot of overlap between shamanic states and the psychoanalytic state, how a certain stillness needs to occur in the therapist and in the shaman to access something. And yeah, so I remember how you got that quite quickly, whereas others were puzzled, but you just immediately clicked onto it. And then we thought, yeah, we might talk again. And I thought, yeah, let's see. And this has been true for many years, hasn't it, Vanessa?
Yeah, because the conference in Iceland was 2014.
That's correct, yes. And I know I was talking about, I think, yes, psychodynamic stuff together with shamanic trance states and how that would unfold. And and also my work with in South Africa and in New Zealand with Indigenous people, the Māori. And I remember you would be able to engage with me, which suggested to me that you yourself had a rich form of knowledge or experience around this area, thinking a bit differently, together with, I think, your poetry and your scissor work, you know, of being able to disengage language in a certain way. And you know, the scissor is for me a form of cutting and shifting and dissociating. And it made me wonder what you do with poetry is what shamans do with their mind. Shifting the mind is the aim. So I just thought your poetry was part of this process.
I love it. No, I remember you spoke on the panel about psychosis. And I remember, first of all, that you spoke about Israel Regardie, who I'd never heard anyone talk about him at a psychoanalytic conference. And I was like, ooh, who is this guy? And then also I loved how you talked about a specific case and how you like went through like a ritual with them to help them like grieve their parents or something, like went to a lake and how some of the analysts were so like appalled, like, oh, you can't like leave the session, everything has to be done in language in the session in this like symbolic abstract way, as if like rituals don't have a purpose and as if people don't like do real actions to like work through material in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's always so difficult when you bring a story to a conference and you're talking for half an hour, it's hard to bring across that you've been working with a person for 18 months, you know. So when this person came to me that I talked about, I think if it is the right person, I had been working for 18 months to make sense of their discourse. You know, they were just speaking and we slowly unpacked it. And he began to realize that some of the psychosis was actually related to the loss of land due to colonization 4 generations ago. You know, that created a poverty, which in turn created abusive family dynamics and substance abuse. And 4 generations, and he is mad. And yet the madness made sense politically and spiritually, that there was a connection. And so we then would begin to work with it. But what I think was important there is that I was allowed to symbolically and ritually engage the person in the cemetery, or what's called an uru pa, where the person could sit with the reality that 2 storks suddenly were flying over the grave as he stood at his mother's grave. And we could symbolically link the synchronistic events. And, you know, the next day he talked to me about a dream he had, which revealed significant childhood or infant abandonment. He suddenly had a dream of being an infant, and it unraveled stories and other parts we had not seen. So I also want to hold that this was done very mindfully, carefully, in collaboration with my patient, but also with the kaumatua, the elder that I was working with. So it was a very careful process that we engaged and planned carefully weeks ahead. And I think you would appreciate the power of rituals and symbolization. And I think for him, the healing came in being able to not only enact symbols with awareness, so it isn't just an unconscious enactment, but an interpreted enactment as it happens. That why is that so different to dream work? You know, we are alive in our dreams. Why is life not also valued as a dream and interpreted as a dream? And I think that's where other cultures are far more, have the ability to symbolize powerfully in seeing their life as worthy of interpretation. So if two storks fly over my mother's grave at the very point I visited it for, you know, I know it's seen as coincident, but those two storks were actually crossed our car 10 miles before. It gets, you know, strange. And then the third time as we're leaving, they land and quite close by and watch. And, you know, so there are things that start happening that are meaningful for the person in life as dreams are meaningful. So it's something that I appreciated in working with within a Māori an indigenous mental health setting, where it is officially accepted that mental health requires an integration of the body, the whānau or family, which also means social system, political systems, the mind, but also the spirit. And so if I had a client who spoke about ancestors, I could open it up with discernment and not claim they are hallucinating. The psychiatrist might be worried, but maybe due to my own shamanic training, I thought, let's see if those voices are useful. And if they're not, okay, we'll do something. But if they are, how do we want to work with them? And that was special about working in that service, that I could do that with my clients. And I suppose in private, it's easier to do, but it's not so easy to talk about that. And so funnily enough, talking about it within an indigenous framework makes it possible, but talking about it in psychoanalytic white circles, difficult.
Yeah, but I think I'm hoping that that'll be part of this like decolonial process, because that's it's like one of the things, like, so I'm from Miami, and in Miami when I was being trained as a psychologist, you know, they actually said like, okay, you know, there's a lot of people from Cuba and Haiti in Miami. So they said, okay, if your patient is Cuban or Haitian, they talk about talking to a grandmother or grandfather or ancestor, then it's okay because it's in a cultural context. But if they're like a white person talking about it, then they need to go to the hospital because they're crazy. They actually taught us that, and it's like that's not okay either, you know?
Exactly. You know, why is it okay that if I'm in London, you know, write a paper or talk on projective identification amongst clients or other psychoanalysts who talk about it, somehow getting through the room into my body as a therapist or analyst and feel it. But if I talk about telepathy, oh, no, that's not okay. You know, so there's this kind of strange epistemological even inability to challenge the edges of reality, and that other cultures may have other vantage points from which reality is viewed, and that maybe others are also more skillful about consciousness. You know, the East has incredible understanding of meditative levels or, you know, states of consciousness, and so do other cultures. But we are pretty monophasic. The waking consciousness is the only acceptable one. You know, whereas others are polyphasic. In other words, other states of consciousness have equal value or validity or even valiance, and they can have truths that might be valuable. But in our society, dreaming is not valued the same as waking consciousness. And so I think psychoanalysis is sadly trapped by that sometimes. Not at all, of course, but and I think the only reason I can sometimes speak at psychodynamics is because there is a postmodern respect for other cultures. It's a right thing, but well, it's a start. But I think or hope that one day it might undermine the limited view of reality within the Western culture. Maybe.
I hope so. That's what I'm working on.
You are indeed.
That's what we're working on right now. I love that you phrased it as like interpreting their lives just as you interpreted dreams, like seeing these things symbolically. Yeah. And I never understand the argument of like, oh, but that's not really happening. You're just making meaning. Yes. And it's like, if that's like the biggest argument against it, like what kind of argument is that? So what, No. If it's useful for the person and they make meaning and it's able to help them like shift something in their lives, and like, who cares?
Exactly. And I think this is also why when I work with people who struggle with what is called hearing voices, it's difficult. I think the catchphrase of psychosis schizophrenia is so broad that it sounds to me not helpful as a clinician. There are people who hear voices, and there are people who have very strong belief systems that are very painful and terrorizing and anxiety provoking, and horrible, and how we could begin to make meaning of that instead of just claiming it's unreal, therefore not worthy. So it seems to me that if I listen carefully, I seem to be able to, together with a person, find value in this and meaning in this, that I think may be much more helpful to bring in those parts that have been lost. And that's an ancient tradition, of course, to bring in the splinter souls that we have lost, that shamans always are flying and trying to get back. To think of the Amazonian ayahuasca shamans who fly off and find the lost parts of souls. Also in Africa, there's a part where there's a sense that they are lost souls, but parts of our souls. But, and I think that's where I don't want to idealize the shamanic tradition either. I think there's sometimes, my experience sometimes has been equally that sometimes quite simplistic stuff would have black and white thinking. It's all demons or it's all angels kind of thing. So I equally struggle with that, the over-interpretation. And that is the shadow side of symbolizing everything, is how do you not create a slippery slope into a world where everything is interpreted the way you want it. So there's this kind of challenge.
And that's a good point. Or feeling like things are being done to you and like everything's outside of your control.
It's a beautiful point. That's something that the externalization of the inner to the outer becomes so strong that you become victimized by everything. And that is, so that's what I appreciate about psychoanalysis, that it makes me wonder, what are my process, what's my part, and where the conflicts within me that might be systemically related to everything and has great value to unpack and take responsibility for. So I must say that I value that about. So for me, the psychoanalysis as a method and as an acknowledgement of the unconscious and the energy with it, psychic energy, I love that part. I find it so valuable. It's the materialistic, epistemological view that I find is a bit of a pity. We don't need it to be involved in psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy. So.
I agree. And I don't like when analysts take other analysts' theory as like dogma. Well, like so-and-so said this, it has to be this way. I like much more eclectic view of like taking from different theorists what find useful for different people, because that could change over time or change the same person over time.
Yeah, I must say I agree with you on that. And I suppose that's where I've noticed also something curious is that the many shamans I met in different traditions equally struggle with sharing their worldview with the people around them. You know, there is a loneliness amongst shamans, and it's equally for our profession as, you know, either psychologists or therapists or psychoanalysts or it's a very lonely, odd profession. You know, that you can't, you know, you like your clients and you can't just have a cup of coffee with them. You know, it's just a crazy world. You're connected, but you cannot meet in the other world. And in the shamanic world, there's something similar, is that they often, I think, also sit on the fringes of idealization and denigration of being this great healer, but all this very evil being, this cursing being. And equally so, shamans will often talk to other shamans and feel more at home amongst other shamans in their own village, because other shamans get the kind of edge places that we position ourselves in. And that, I think, is true. And I think psychoanalysts and shamans or therapists share that, that we are in a liminal space where we work with people. And we need to protect it through privacy, confidentiality, and not engaging in everyday life with them. Something about that.
Yeah, that transitional space, and also reminds me of like the transference, like the people clients or the shaman's clients are going to have transference. Like, you're going to be able to fix everything for me, or if you don't, like, you're the worst. I hate you. You're cursing me.
Exactly. You know. Oh, yeah. There is an interesting tradition in the South African tradition of the sangoma, where, and in the 30s, when people would go to a doctor, they'd sit very quietly, and the doctor would ask, "So what's wrong with you?" They says, "No, you need to tell me." And the white doctor would say, "What do you mean? You here? What's your problem? What do you want to know?" And in the sangoma tradition, when you walk into the hut and sit on the ground opposite your client, they will be absolutely silent. They'll roll up the money and put it under the impala or antelope skin, and then you throw the bones. You have to tell your client what's wrong. So that is actually a form of verification and checking out how good the shaman is. Because if you can't say what is wrong with a person, you wouldn't even know what the cure is. So there's this kind of interesting testing that comes by waiting silently and then seeing what comes up in the divination. And your reading of that will need to trigger or be true to who the person is sitting. So, and they will then just say "Siyavuma," which means "I agree," and then that's "Siyavuma," or they go quiet, which always is trouble. So I remember this one training I had where my teacher would bring me in, and I was pretty terrified because I wasn't as yet aware of all the interconnections with my divination tool. And I saw this configuration, symbolic configuration, that I went, but I don't know why. She said, "But there's something good that's happened to her, you know." And I said, "Yes, that's correct. Something about work and something good." He says, "Yes, she got a promotion. Excellent." So I'm going, "Why is she here?" And he says, "No, she's here because she's worried about the jealousy of other people, and she wants a medicine to protect her against jealousy of others." So this was very helpful for me, that people don't only come to shame because it's bad or difficult, but also because they've been very successful. And the envy is a very real dynamic that I wasn't so aware of, but they've helped me to become aware of more. So, you know, so it's a very different approach. So there's a verification. We've got our certificates, but it's the power also lies with the client to see whether we are good enough.
How did you become interested in sangoma in the first place?
Well, actually, the interesting thing about becoming a sangoma, you don't choose it. The ancestors do. And this is how it worked for me, is that this must have been 82 or something. There was a course on African psychology, which a psychology lecturer was providing, and he said, if you do want to have an experience of a sangoma reading the bones or using divination to read your story, why don't you come and see him on, I don't know which day it was it a Thursday or during the week you could go in? And I thought, that would be interesting, because I was already interested. Well, you heard from my reference with Israel Regardie. I was reading Israel Regardie already then, and, just interested in these altered states. And so I went to see him. I was absolutely quiet, sat down, and he said, and did some reading, got some things right. And then he says, you need to become a healer. And I thought, yeah, okay, it's true. I want to become a psychologist. That's a healer. He said, yeah. He said, no, you need to become a sangoma. I said, what? Are you sure? And he says, no, you need to become a sangoma. Now, at that time in the 80s, the apartheid system had closed off townships. Police were, creating these cordons. And I first had my doubts because at that time, nowadays it's far more popular. You have white sangomas, but at that time I'd never heard of that. I thought, how would this be possible? So I thought, well, why not? He says, why don't you come to Soweto? And he gave me an address, which I had never been to. At that time, it was really, it was a battlefield. This was after 1976 with the Soweto riots. And still, there were battles between police. So I'm driving with my little black Volkswagen Beetle, rattling around. And then I realized there are no street signs. I found out later that most street signs were taken down and used as washing poles to hang up washing in between, as a form of resistance as well, I suppose. So I don't know how I found him. I think something happened. But I then was initiated. He told me that the tradition is that your ancestors choose you. You often go through an illness, an initiation illness, and the ancestors push you, and the bones are read, or the diviner, and they will tell you whether you need to train as a healer. And in many traditions all over the world, it is seldom I'm rocking up and feel like I'd like to become a shaman. That's not how it works. And in fact, to use a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic term, there's often huge resistance. And this resistance is well known. He would say, yeah, I know you don't feel like doing this, because I had my doubts. I said, look, are you serious? I'm just 20, 21, whatever. You were you sitting in Soweto. Is this real? He says, no, come on the weekends and we'll get going. And so I decided to do this, and my training started. And then it became really difficult, more and more difficult, 83, to get into Soweto. I struggled to get in. I had no telephone. There were no cell phones. The telephone lines didn't work. I just couldn't get through certain cordons. And what happened then is that we lost contact, because the South African Army was calling up foreign or permanent residents, citizens, or permanent resident people who were from other countries. So I'm German. So they were suddenly saying anyone under 25 would have to serve in the military. So I refused. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Because I'm not going to be part of a civil war. So I finished my master's in comparative literature, where, funnily enough, we were reading Freud and Marx, and it was great. But once I finished that, I went to Germany, and on Mandela's release, I returned. And that allowed, then I wouldn't be conscripted to the army, which I was happy about. And then I carried on doing psychology, got into a clinical program, but I'd lost touch with my teacher, I then did a PhD. And in that, I was going to look at which I did, on the altered states or the trance states of sangomas, but more their experience of how to enter it, the technology of accessing these states and how that occurs. And funnily enough, the shamans were incredibly open about that. They said, these are questions we've never wondered about, but they would have never given me the recipes for healing, or the muti, or the medicine, because that is seen as very important for making money because you have the special mixtures and all of that. So that's something they wouldn't share. But how they enter into trance, they were very open and curious. And then one day, a sangoma recognized me from, about 10 years before then or something, about when I was a young shaman. And he says, I know you and I know where your teacher is. And so we reconnected and I completed my graduation. And the graduation is a tough thing because it's not just, you just do 3 years of training. It's usually about 2-3 years, but you actually have to find objects that are hidden. So I decided not to have it in a township. I wanted to go into the country a bit more. So I went to his homestead where he was trained, and I met his teacher. And before I could even enter the graduation, she asked me to come sit with her, and on the ground, of course. And I was bowing and being respectful. And she said, I've got a bone. I said, no. She said, I've got something. Where is it? I was just going, and what is it? Going, I said, it's a bone. She says, correct. And it's right in front of me, but I couldn't see it. And she laughed, and she had a long dress on. She opened up a fold of her dress and took out the bone that was right in front of me. So that was the pre-graduation test. And in front of the community that is drumming away, you are asked to enter trance states over 3 days, and they hide objects. And your teacher doesn't know it. So it's a double blind, so they don't cheat and tell you. So I needed to find objects through my trance. They were hidden in certain corners of a hut or were buried in the ground. And they were quite skeptical that a white person could do this. So when I first found it, they didn't believe me. They thought I must have cheated. So they made me do it again, which anyway, so it was scary because, as you know, entering trance state is not something you can just switch on and off. I was quite concerned with, I wasn't sure if I'd make it, so, but I believe that's a very common experience. So it was, so that's how it happened. And there is and also during my time while I was, I'd lost contact with my teacher. I had gone to other sangoma just for readings, just for fun and just to see what they say. And many a time they said, no, you need to become a sangoma. And I thought, and so it seemed to have been verified by others who did not know my teacher at all. So that was part of how I entered into that tradition. And when I asked my teacher once, why do you, it's a bit strange having a white person. What's that? What was that about? And he just laconically said to me, and the ancestors aren't racist. That shut me up. That just closed down that argument.
Yeah, exactly. The ancestors don't have those divides that we've created.
Exactly. So he was, I think also what I appreciated about him, he was, he was the chairperson of his local Communist Party group. He was Shangaan, so he believed that your lineage or ancestors is both female and male, and hence he believed it was a softer path, or both integrating male and female parts. And whereas other tribes like the Nguni, the Zulu, and the Xhosa, the patriarchal line comes through very powerfully. And they are understood, at least by Shangaan, to be also more aggressive and more, so that was interesting. So there are differences in the way the training happens. He felt, there were some trainings that weren't good enough. It's just like in psychoanalysis. There's some schools that are very strict, others are more relaxed. And so it's that's why I think kind of circling back to the engagement, just like with a therapeutic alliance, the client tests the shaman to see if a connection is real, whether this person can see things or hear things or notice things and read things. So that's something that is part of that, and your graduation is seen as that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes sense. And
Okay.
I also love this point, though, that I think is important to make, of trusting, the shaman, trusting people to make these decisions. Like he channeled or knew that
That's right.
you were to become a sangoma. Whereas
Yeah.
like my friend Genesis, went to Benin and was initiated by Voodoo elders there. And some people that I know back in America were like, oh, that's an appropriation of this other culture. But it's the elders' decision or the ancestors' decision that the elders recognizing
Yes.
that this person is to be initiated into this. And it's this kind of opposite sort of racism, or like looking down on another culture that they don't know who belongs there and who doesn't, like as if we could just go and appropriate their culture because we decided to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, look, and for me it was a bit odd because I was steeped in, at that time in structural Marxism and in racism, and I belonged to a very anti-apartheid university. My lecturers were feminists, fantastic, and we were just grappling with question like, is psychoanalysis even relevant for Black people? How does, in our work with the trauma that at that time, just before the Mandela got elected, we learned that maybe, yes, it may be incredibly bad, and that our clients valued it, that approach, the symbolic approach, the ability to reflect on conflicts and defenses. And so it's not so simple. And you're right, of course, the concern of appropriation, but it's not my choice to become a sangoma. It's not so simple. And that's why, thank you for raising that, because I think that's why even if within their own tradition, people get dragged into this profession rather than move in and want to take it. It's too hard. It costs a lot of money usually, and it is a life that is outside of the ordinary. So many people don't want that. You're never going to belong in the same way. And that's true for psychoanalysts too. You work unbelievably hard, it costs a lot of money, and you sit in a little room and talking to people, and your life is never ordinary, and you don't belong in the same way. You can't talk about your work, your successes and your failures. You can't, so it's, excuse me, so it's something that isn't actually sought out in the traditional aspect as some glorious path. No, it is a hard path. It is a painful path. And due to the initiation crisis, or if you wish, the spiritual emergency, it is usually initiated through pain, through growth, through cleansing, through often psychotic experience for some, physical illnesses for others, hardship. So the notion that you could just walk in and appropriate, I have to say that would be a strange view, at least in the Sangoma tradition. But it's really good that you bring that up, because I think it takes away the power of, at least in my tradition, Sangoma, to channel and to be open to other dynamics where these things don't matter. It's our small life that makes that important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good point as well. Like this idea that some people do go through these spiritual emergencies, and sometimes they're psychotic episodes or physical illnesses. And, the differences between cultures who are aware of that people go through these experiences and have a context for it to help people work through them and maybe, evolve into a healer or something. versus the culture like the Western dominant medical culture that just pathologizes it and doesn't recognize it as part of the human experience for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think that's been a lot of my work, is the interface of spirituality or culture and the clinical, and equally in a discerning way, you know. So for example, I was working with one Maori psychiatric nurse that we got on very well with, and we sometimes took clients together or worked with them together, and you know, we would sometimes do very strong boundary DBT, you know, dialectical behavior therapy stuff, because we had high risk people, and we would sometimes do cultural processes. And we were able to sometimes say, yes, that person's going through a spiritual measurement, that person as well. That person thinks she is, but isn't. That one was. So is to begin to understand that actually in many cultures, in some not, but there is some discernment on this. So for example, in the sangoma tradition, ukutwasa is the initiation illness that will, you know, where you can hear voices, you can feel sick, you often can get depressed. And then you have fumiana, which is the illness, there's the possession of beings that equally create psychosis and unwellness and depression. But there's treatments different. One requires healing and a cure. The other one requires healing and training. So the ukutwasa requires healing and training so that you master those voices to serve the community. And that's what it is about. This is about service. This is about serving. And your trance states are not there to be flashy or amazing. It's actually very pragmatic. Where's the medicine to get that, to heal that patient's kidney who's coming in tomorrow? You know, that's the kind of stuff. Not in any kind of weird, wonderful searching for the ultimate way. So for many, it is hard work. So, and same as with psychoanalysis.
I also like that your point earlier as well, even with patients who are like psychotic, like really psychotic.
Yes.
If you listen to people speak about it, you can make sense of it or where it came from, and like learn how to treat it or how to help them work through it. Because when I was in my early 20s, I had a close friend whose mother was schizophrenic, and she lived in the house with him because when he was younger, she was medicated and also hospitalized often. But when he was a teenager, when he was an adolescent, he got very like, you know, don't medicate my mom. She should be able to be who she is and that sort of thing. So he like was supporting her and like being in the house, and he basically took care of her until he passed away. But since I spent so much time there because we were such good friends and lived near each other, I got to know her really well, and she was always speaking in these just kind of run-on sentences that you at first didn't make any sense. But if you spend enough time with her, I started realizing that she actually had like these 4 different storylines going on that were like these 4 different traumatic experiences that she had had. And she would like literally speak like one sentence in like this setting, and then one from this story or timeline, then one from this and one from this, and was kind of going in this loop. And so if you like heard every 4th sentence was this story, then you could like hear where that story is going, and every 4th sentence was this story. And after a while, it just like I got used to it, and she just made perfect sense because I understood what she was doing all the time.
Perfect.
And like she couldn't function in a day-to-day societal way, but like she was living at home, and it did make sense. And then when you understood what these traumatic experiences were, you could see where she kind of got unraveled there.
Deborah Lamshire is an expert voice hearer, and we both actually gave a talk on how you know, she mastered her voices and how a shaman sangoma masters their voices, and the amazing similarities, because ultimately It's going to be about your relationship with the voices. The aim is not to quieten the voices, which is often the psychiatric path, or to annihilate them, but to create a relationship with them and to begin to listen to them and see what value you can gain from them, what the emotional content is. And it's the same for the training as a sangoma. When you're a twasa, an apprentice, one of my people I interviewed said it beautifully, Pauline. She said that the aim of the training is actually to have a healthy, equal relationship with the ancestors, so they don't dominate you, nor do you dominate them. And that there will be times you say, look, not today, or I'm in the bus at the moment, I can't talk to you, but we will engage in a respectful connection. And in some ways, you started unpicking with this person the traumatic stories that were circulating. And if she could engage with that in a way that might have been healing or not, I don't know. But Deborah and I have spoken about this at conferences, and I think there's something to be said about approaching these experiences, these phenomena, let's call it that, because that takes away the pathologizing. If they're difficult, and they are as a twasa, you hear things, you get scared, or for some it's traumatizing. And due to trauma, we know that trauma gives people the ability to dissociate, which then means that if you train that up, your ability to shift consciousness is already set up, if you wish. That's why, many mediums or shamans often have stories of trauma. The ability to dissociate is there. Not always, but sometimes. And so for us equally, just like with you, is to find meaning in the voice, but then to engage relationally with them. Whether you call it an internal object or not, maybe doesn't matter. But it's how do you engage with it meaningfully? And here's where I think, where I've often said, we have the terrible voice of psychosis on the one hand. We have the voices that people are hearing that are non-threatening. It's about 10 to 15%, or 5 to 15% of the so-called normal populace actually hears voices, but they are not bothered by it. But what we're not accepting in the Western world of psychology is that there's another level of mastery where the voices you hear function to create knowledge that is either to do with healing or to access information. And that part is missing still in the psychological understanding. So voices the mastery of that process is something we don't acknowledge yet, officially.
I love that. No, I love that. And I think maybe what you said earlier about thinking of waking life more as a dream, working in it like you would work with a dream, maybe that kind of way of thinking could help shift that a bit. We could think of it as a lucid dream. We have a little more control.
Exactly. So what you're bringing up, that's beautiful. So when I talk to psychoanalysts about lucid dreams, many have no clue what that is.
No.
But I talk to shamans, they know immediately what I'm talking about. And it's because there is no training. I think there is one footnote in Freud's interpretation of dreams in that colossal work on lucid dreams, which he believes is just the ego taking control of the dream. That might be so, but it misses the point of what you can do with a lucid dream and how you can access ancestor or information to heal yourself or others or whatever. So thank you for that. That's a very good, another good example where shamans have a skill set of shifting consciousness within dreams, whereas in psychoanalysis, it's merely seen as a passive process. So unfortunately closes the door to many other states of awareness, which is a pity. But that's, thank you. That's great.
And I'm wondering too, now even in more mainstream psychoanalysis, people are acknowledging transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I'm also hoping that will be like a connect with like ancestors and ancestor work, because now that seems to be more and more mainstream.
Yes. I agree that intergenerational trauma must open up the problematic notion that pain can travel through us. And maybe there are, so for example, there might be some suggestion of genetic changes due to epigenetics. So if I have experienced severe trauma, what does it do to my genes, which then get propagated through children? So there are some queries, interesting developments maybe. And that is true for our ancestors, that the voices of our ancestors, you're right, maybe it's one way that they may become accepted or acceptable. But anyway, I think, in terms of psychoanalysis, the unconscious would hold our ancestors in some degree or form. And I suppose some shamans use them more consciously, relationally, to access information, but they get tested. So my teacher would say, so I asked him one day, I says, look, how do you know that the voices you hear or the ancestors you hear are not talking nonsense? And, how would you know that? He says, oh, that's easy. We just test them. And that kind of is exactly the point. It's not a naive belief. This is not a religion. This is not a claim. This is verified. So if an ancestor tells me there's a certain medicine under that tree, and if it isn't there, my teacher told me to really speak to that ancestor, say, that's not good enough. You need to give me good information. Or if the information is vague, I need to sharpen it by demanding more details. So there's this very strong push of verification to those ancestors that they need to be specific enough to give information. And that's where my experience was, that this is not about religion only or belief. This is something more interesting. Just like when you listen to the stories, you could unpick that actually there was some very real traumatic events going on here. But it was your capacity to be specifically listening for it that unpacked this a bit. This is trauma-induced, likely, or various traumas, the story you talked about.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think it's a good point as well. Western medicine is like this old as far as human history goes, and thinks it's like the end all be all, and says that all these things are not scientific, but actually these practices are often like thousands of years old and passed on for generations, and people have tested and retested and refined the practices over a long time.
And I also think there are some that are better at this than others. There are some traditions that don't do so well. So, for example, I think it's worth, absolutely, I think the Chinese tradition of martial arts, and there's a phenomenal development in the world that, they've done really well. And shamans have done really well with certain states of consciousness, but not all of them. And equally, so I don't want in any way to lose my sense of discernment in this, to acknowledge that there are people who do this better and some who may do this for other reasons, just like with everything.
Just like with everything.
That's exactly. So but this is why for me, my interest in these states is not as a belief, as something that I have to accept, quite the contrary. So if a sangoma sits and throws the bones and talks and doesn't get it, then I have the right to take my money and leave. And that is the tradition, that a client can take their money and go if you don't get it, because it needs to be verified, and hence the silence of the client. And it's hard when you suddenly see people sitting in front of you stone-faced, just like psychoanalysts, sit there quietly waiting for you, and some days you're on and some days you're not so on. It's interesting. And so how do you read it? And there's, so we get it, but it's literally like you need to be able to say, no, I came here for your right knee. You've come here because your right knee is hurting. And they're just sitting, you can't always see that, or it's about a relationship difficulty, or it's about, so even though you may, if you're very skilled observers, pick up a lot, if somebody is in pain, that's obvious, but the expectation is to be quite detailed, but it's and there will be others who better. And by the way, I also want to add that in my training, my teacher would always say, look, some people have very powerful ancestors, some don't. We don't know why. The other thing is some people are more skilled with divination, some are skilled with the herbs, some are skilled with dancing, as you would call it. Yeah, people are different. And this is also true for psychoanalysts and for us. We are different, and therefore the work will be different. And I think that's helpful to hold as well. They're not all equal.
That's a good point. So what are you working on now, Ingo?
Oh, I don't know. I'm working on, I've been asked to edit a book on culture and psychosis. So looking on the interpretation of, from different areas of the world, but also problematizing our notion of what psychosis is, So, for example, we just did a webinar. I was lucky enough to moderate 3 amazing people, and through racism and psychosis. And it just unpacked that the notion of psychosis is determined by a racist stance and structure, and is, the treatment of it is determined as well. So there are issues to unpack, that madness is constructed, and different cultures will construct it differently. And I'm going to write a chapter on how in the shamanic tradition, madness is viewed differently, and what else there could be. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Oh, look, if anybody wants to see any writing or stuff I've done, or to just go to YouTube or Google and just type in my name, and stuff will come up on culture or shamanic or clinical parapsychology or stuff like that. So it's all there. So
yeah, and I'll have to plug our paper. We wrote a paper together on psychoanalytic and shamanic states and transitional. Yes. And that's in the Fenris Wolf 8. So I'll put a link to that.
Yes. Yeah, so I've also written on for an art magazine, an African art magazine, on the aesthetics of trance states, how you have visions and voices and the aesthetics of it. So I've been quite curious about that. But these are all various interests I have, and people will find them on the net and see if it resonates with them, to go and explore.
Perfect. Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Ingo Lambrecht. For more, you can check out his papers in the Fenris Wolf, volumes 8 and 9, and also read his book, Sangoma Trance States. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. And now, the song, Bring Forth Our Ancestors, Embrace Ourselves, from the album Follow My Voice, with Per Åhlund. Available at Bandcamp and in limited edition CD form from Highbrow Lowlife. Entrepart Editions. Enjoy. Sometimes I bring forth our ancestors, those who went before us, carry out so much brutality. I don't think transformed. Crossing places, seeking the deep roots and connections where we surge forth. Carry out so much brutality. I don't think. Transformed. Let us seek not escape, but embrace ourselves. The reports of thee at the end of his book tell us of his personal circumstances, of the new age and the immortalist corporate loss of physical culture in the occult, and remembered was once identical to the otherworldly or inhuman. Carry out so much brutality. I don't think. Transformed. I cannot speculate on a better world is possible. Carry out so much brutality. I don't think. Transformed. We are instead deep and do embody mortality. Live for all to see. 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 Live for all to see.